broadcast live on YouTube, on Twitter, on different social media channels, and this session will continue to be played, so you can come back and see it if you wish to. It is all in the English language. However, there is interpretation in Arabic, and if you're on Zoom, you can go to the globe and turn the interpretation into Arabic. So أهلا وسهلا جميعا والذي يفضل أن يستمع إلى الجلسة باللغة العربية.
Welcome all. If you would like to listen to our session in Arabic, please press on the globe that you have. And now you have interpretation, you have French. If you press on French, you will listen to Arabic interpretation. Thank you.
And I want to first, of course, welcome our panel. We have with us Jihad Azor, Director of the IMF Middle East and Central Asia Department. Also, Dr. Rania Al-Mashab, Minister of International Cooperation from Egypt. Karim Al-Ainawi, President of the Policy Center for the New South Morocco. And Alam Bajani, Chief Executive Officer at Majid Al-Fatim here in the UAE. So thank you all for joining us. This really has been a transformative year, and Jihad, I want to turn to you. Some of that transformation is going to be really long-lasting and across different sectors. And some of the changes we're witnessing are actually not going to be permanent. We'll probably see a return to something that some people are saying a new normal, but we'll have some of the elements of what we recognize. So if you could start us off, please, giving us your thinking about what will be permanent change, and if some of that change is detrimental, how do we mitigate against it? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mina. And again, I would like to join my voice to yours to welcome everyone on this panel. This is, in the history of crises, this is an exceptional one. I think it's a crisis like no other for several reasons, by its depth, by its spread, and I think also because we're still in the middle of the crisis itself, given the level of uncertainties. But one can clearly say that this is going to be a transformative crisis, will change the way economies are going to work going forward. And the reason for that is coming from the fact that this crisis is about disruption and acceleration. We saw certain activities and sectors being disrupted. And this is in somehow a vertical crisis whereby the real sector was affected in some of its big components. And for example, in the region, tourism is one of those sectors that were highly affected. But also this is an acceleration because we see that technology is moving very fast. Of course, those are not new trends. Those trends existed before, but they were accelerated and fast-forwarded by the crisis. I think what is also important in any crisis is to recognize quickly the nature of the crisis and to react fast and accelerate the road to recovery. If also we go back to previous crises, one of the key issues that differentiated countries, those who were able to accelerate the transformation, use this as an opportunity to do reforms that existed or that were known before, but their time didn't come. Those countries were able to recover very fast. Those who did not do lagged behind. And this is one of the lessons from the 2008 crisis for the region. Countries who did not recognize the crisis and moved fast did not retrieve the level of trends that existed before. And this is one of the key messages of our analysis is countries need to move fast, otherwise we could waste a decade and not recovering to the levels we had pre-crisis. Second, it's very important to look at the silver linings and to build on them, but recognizing them, it's not enough. It requires a set of actions, a set of policies, and this is where the role of the state is very important. Set of actions, and this is the role of the private sector, financial sector, as well as also investors, is very important, as well as also the role of international institutions like the fund and other institutions in helping accelerate those trends. But also it's very important to address some of the scars that will last for long. And here we need to address the vulnerabilities. And some of the vulnerabilities were revealed during this crisis. Informality, one of the key issues that didn't allow the deployment of support to a big part of the population. The capacity to work flexibly working from home or remotely proved to be one of the issues or handicaps that did not allow the country, some countries in the region to accelerate their adaptation. Making sure that our infrastructure is ready, especially in terms of technology, in terms of education, in terms of training and capacity building, and access to finance. It's very important, especially that we rank low on that. Last but not the least, I think inclusion is very important. Youth and women are the key drivers for growth, but we are preventing the region from getting the full benefit of those. Therefore, I think we're in those moments where one element would not fix it, but a strategy that is set clearly with all the stakeholders around the table as we are today. We have policymakers, we have private sector, we have thinkers. I think this is the approach that one could use going forward. And this is, in fact, the essence of our analysis this year during the annual meetings. And this is the reason why in our regional outlook, we focused on some of those important issues.
Thank you very much. I want to just ask you a follow-on question, and then I'll turn to you, Dr. Rania, if you can build up on this idea, the permanent change and the impermanent and temporary changes, but also how different countries in the region have been able to deal with everything that we faced this year. But first, Jihad, I want to ask you about the fact that initially the IMF's prediction for the economic fallout wasn't as severe as we've had a revised one in October. So tell us why. Why do you think it's deeper than initially estimated?
Two things. One, it was not only one shock, it was a multiple shock. In addition to the COVID shock, we had the drop in oil price. We need to remember that we reached level of oil prices that were not seen for 2 decades. We had an excess of supply that at some time reached 20 million barrel a day. Therefore, it was a succession of shock. But I would not want to stop here, because I think with the challenges that many countries had entering this crisis, the way the region managed the shock, both the sanitary one as well as also the economic one, proved to be very well done in terms of spreading of the virus, fatality rate. The region is performing much better than other parts of the world. Some of the best practices came from the region in terms of using technology. And despite the differences in infrastructure, I think all countries reacted very quickly, putting the right measures, the safety measures and the healthcare measures to protect lives. But also we saw countries deploying a series of fiscal and monetary actions to provide support to the real economy. Of course, countries have different means, and therefore their capacity to react was different. But I would say phase one of what we are seeing as transformation, we reacted well. I think the risk today is to be complacent and think that this is over, and not to consider this as an important call for action that requires to maintain the overall stability that we all need, because this is the essence of confidence. And here I'm thinking about the macroeconomic stability, but also to see what are the reforms that are needed today to leapfrog the transformation and accelerate the path from crisis management to recovery.
Thank you so much. So from crisis management to recovery, Dr. Rania, it's a great segue to bring you in here. I mean, how can countries in the region weather the storm? It would be really interesting to hear, of course, about Egypt and the experience that Egypt has had, and what are the long-term implications do you see that COVID-19 will have on your growth projections?
Thank you, Mina. I'm very happy to join colleagues back at the IMF. And I want to pick up on, I think Jihad did a fantastic job in putting setting the stage and the outset for the discussion. In the regional economic outlook on page 21, which is chapter 2, there is detail about how we identify the difference between temporary and permanent shocks and how we try to mitigate those. And the IMF identifies two very distinguished points. One is initial conditions matter. And the second is policy reactions during the crisis and afterwards matter as well. And here, let me discuss Egypt in that light. Initially, between 2016 and 2019, we had a homegrown program supported by the IMF. And that program had macroeconomic stability, of course, at its heart, but also several reforms on the energy side and other sectoral reforms. So we entered 2020 with foreign exchange buffers, which were favorable, with a primary fiscal surplus. So all of that was essential. The initial condition was one that helped us mitigate the immediate socioeconomic implications of the crisis. Something else that happened also between 2016 and 2019. And here this concept of not being complacent, but reform is an ongoing and continuous process. In addition to the macroeconomic stability that the country was committed to under the reform program, there were also sectoral developments. And when you take a look at the projections of the IMF, or of the World Bank, or of EBRD, and I'm Egypt's governor in several institutions, you find that 2020 is a country where Egypt is singled out in terms of its growth rate, and also for 2021. And that comes on the back of a very, I would say, focused, sectoral, multi-sectoral investment program, reforms that took place, if you will, on the education front. And that happened with our multilateral partners. And given that I'm the Minister of International Cooperation, some of the very important programs related to social security, social safety nets, like Takaful Karama with the World Bank, if we're talking about education and digital transformation of education, also with the World Bank. If you're talking about the ability to be able to scale up these programs when the crisis hit, that infrastructure was there. Something else which is extremely important, and this comes as well in terms of the regional economic outlook that the IMF put out, is the ability to be able to mobilize resources in order to push forward. And the only way that countries are able to do that is if they have predictable policy. And that's why we moved further with the IMF with a standby agreement. The standby agreement is one where the projections are transparent, the government's policy framework is published, and in it you will find that in addition to maintaining macroeconomic stability through different policy actions, there are also matrices related to structural reforms, whether it's increased competition, transparency, governance, and of course, trying to push on the private sector engagement as well. So I can go in more details with respect to the different sectors that we moved from shortages, for instance, in electricity. Now there are electricity grids. If we think about regional integration or regional fora, we have, for instance, the Euromed Gas Forum, which is a partnership. You have Egypt, Italy, Palestine, Jordan, Israel, and Greece and Cyprus, with the private sector as well. So this is also another example of how we are moving on the regional front. Just recently, we were also on a high-level mission with the PM in Iraq, and there's a lot in terms of making use of the crisis in the sense that how is it that we can provide the different the reforms that we've done in different sectors into other countries and so forth. So there's, I think the message from the first round is initial conditions matter, keep on reforming, because you never know when the next crisis is. We are not out of the woods yet. And that's why we are continuing in a very transparent way, announcing our different policy reforms. And finally, as Minister of International Cooperation, I was very proud that since the beginning of the year and despite the pandemic, we were able to secure ODA financing across different sectors, including for the private sector, with a number of around $7.3 billion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rania. Alan, I want to come to you because we heard about macroeconomic stability, big picture, what governments can do, reform processes that take a long time. But of course, for you and for many people who are working in the private sector, and microeconomic impact that's happened over the last few months is quite immediate. And so I'd like to ask you, first of all, what you've learned from the changes that retail and other major sectors had to undergo in the last few months. And also, to what extent you think if a second wave comes or if lockdowns have to go on longer, private sector in this region can actually hold out? And of course, with the caveat that different sectors and different countries in the region are at different stages, but a more general look, please.
Thank you very much, Mina, and thank you for having me. I mean, look, I would say one of the big lessons that we've learned very early on in this process is the importance of resilience over efficiency. And I think this is something that simply we're moving from a word to a new word. And companies that did not have resilience, and that works for both private sector, of course, but also public sector to a certain extent, have suffered more than others during this pandemic. This being said, this is an unusual situation. Companies, a lot of companies are not set up to actually survive this kind of crisis. So I think market dynamics are to be accepted, and a lot of companies, especially SMEs, suffered from this and will continue to suffer from this. I don't think we are at the end of this any situation. So I agree with Jihad. The big problem that we currently have is our ability to adapt and what I call the absorption. And this is where, when we move from macro to micro, okay, great stuff that's happening. I fully agree with Her Excellency. I think Egypt has entered this crisis in a great situation compared to other countries in the region. And despite, I would say, the burden of scale and the burden of the reality, Egypt has actually fared much better than others and will exit much better than others. And definitely the energy, I would say at large, the energy solution that is the result of the past 5 years, if not more, of great work, in my opinion, ushers a great era of growth for Egypt going forward. So I'm personally continue to be very bullish on the future of Egypt. This being said, the absorption rate in our systems, despite reforms that are very slow, we have to accept it in the region, make that a lot of the macroeconomic policies less effective at the microeconomic level. I think this is something that we really have to work together on, the private sector, the public sector, and international institutions, primarily the IMF and the World Bank. I continue to believe, and we've seen it, in this part of the world, that whenever you have what we call fiscal stimulus in place, in reality, the fiscal stimulus tries to actually shave off some burden, but does not really inject money where the money actually is needed the most. And in most of the cases, I don't want to name any country in particular. I mean, we operate in every market, every country in this region. 92% of the people that actually benefited from, for example, debt rescheduling with banks were the ones that needed it the least. Because at the end of the day, banks are banks, and they would operate in a way that actually makes the most sense for them from an underwriting standpoint. And I think this is something that we have to be aware of in order to preserve jobs. And this theme of lives and livelihoods. I also agree with Jihad that the region has fared much better than anywhere else or most of any other places globally in terms of having keeping a handle of the pandemic and preventing spread and preventing catastrophes like we've seen in most developed countries. I would say we're not able to do as much. And I have to say that Dubai and the UAE have been a fantastic place to be in during COVID and continue to be a fantastic place actually to prepare for recovery. So that's great. But why is it so? It is so because beyond fiscal monetary policy, and I'm not saying that there are not efforts that needs to be done, the business infrastructure is there. And this is what I think, what is it, priceless. I mean, you can put money, you can get funding, whether it's to finance monetary policy or to finance fiscal measures or actually reform in terms of discipline. But the reality is having a business infrastructure that actually is enabling is very important. And I really wish that every country in the region could actually adopt the same approach towards that. So, because this is actually what enables, this is what money can't buy. And this is what makes, in my opinion, the biggest difference in the region. Going back to your second question, which is basically how are we faring, and how is the reality on the ground I really believe that this issue of a second wave, I'm not really concerned about it in the region. I think the region, every country in the region, with no exception really, have got a much better handle. The ones that have accepted and that had agreed to accept a certain level of cases that are going to be there until we have a vaccine are there, fine, where people are living with it. I think every country is becoming smarter in terms of the measures to be put in place. Not all of them are as disciplined as we know. But what I'd like to say here is that the markets here in our part of the world are adapting to that, and I think with the vaccines being kind of weeks or months away, this is also giving kind of a lot of hope for people in the region. One of the things that we don't discuss enough is the fact that we actually have a vaccine that's being inoculated as we speak in the UAE, and we have large portions of the population that already have gotten it. Yes, we're talking most about Moderna and Pfizer and potentially other vaccines coming because they are Moderna and Pfizer, and because they are going to be FDA approved. But the reality is we have vaccines that are already proven effective to a large extent so far, and in the UAE where I'm living, hundreds, thousands of people have already been inoculated, and this is actually being rolled out. So the good news is there. I mean, as Fauci said, I mean, the cavalry is coming. This issue is going to be dealt with. Now we really need to.
Sorry, so until the cavalry arrives, can especially for the smaller enterprises, can they survive until that cavalry arrives?
Well, look, the reality is, and I'm going to be, I mean, you're going to excuse me for being blunt. The reality is small enterprises need a bridge, because whatever we do, we can, tell them, don't pay electricity, you're going to pay less taxes. This doesn't keep them alive. What keeps them alive is our ability to fund their cost or a portion of their cost, depending on the level of business they're doing, for a period of time, and tell them, look, you're going to repay that over a period of 7 to 10 years at, in my opinion, preferential rates. I think I discussed this with Jihad a number of times before. I continue to believe that this is what is needed at, I would say, the grassroots level, at the coalface. And yes, a lot of countries do not have the same means, and a lot of countries have to intervene in different ways. But at the end of the day, the solution, however you get to it, is the same. When you have a company that, let's say, just for the sake of example, has a $2 million cost a year and spent a year not being able to get there, and reduced its cost, let's say, to $500,000, okay, but they have obligations, you have to find a way to bridge them. And if you push their obligation by a year, that's going to pile up with other obligations that are coming. And this is why we're going to be seeing more and more companies, that will, in my opinion, in 2021, this domino effect will become much more real than it currently is.
Thank you so much, Alan. A lot of food for thought there, and I want to bring Karim into the conversation to follow up talking about SMEs and companies that have to weather the storm. And of course, there's the informal sector in the region, which we all know about, but we really saw get directly affected by the developments of the last few months. So how can that, how much was the informal sector aggravated and damaged by this, but was there any effort to try to bring it into more formal means, let's say? Over to you, Ken.
Thank you, Mina, and it's a pleasure to be with friends. Well, let me give you just a ballpark number in terms of what was the impact on the Moroccan economy when we get completely confined almost in, March and for 3 months. Basically, we lost 3 percentage points of GDP per month of confinement. That's the numbers that we have for Morocco. And about 60%, based on the survey of the firms, suspended their activities during this period. And it has been very hard, of course, as it was mentioned by previous speakers. It's not a homogeneous shock. It has been very hard, of course, on particularly for Morocco, the tourism sector, for example. Basically no activity with huge fixed costs. but also for the informal sector, basically people living on a day-to-day sort of revenue without, social protection, without health insurance, without pension funds, without safety nets, basically. And there was a program and that was, engineered by the government, and Moroccans show very strong solidarity. There was a fund, Solidarity Fund, that will, managed to raise about 3 percentage points of GDP, which is a big amount, significant. We have no memories of such a sort of, the country getting together to provide solidarity and a response, both individuals and companies. And this money was redistributed partly to bridge financing for vulnerable small companies, but also through direct cash transfers to workers in the informal sectors, basically channeling the equivalent of 200 euros per month over about 3 months. But that's not, of course, sustainable. Now we're back to some sort of, semi-normal situation with the, relative restrictions on specific sectors. But let me tell you what I draw from this. I think there are a couple of messages in terms of policy. Policy lessons, I would say, and I subscribe to what Rania has said in terms of initial conditions, etc., the state of the macro policy, the sustainability of the fiscal, etc. But what I draw from that, and I think the Moroccan government has drawn, is that it is very important that you have a capacity to channel interventions at the smaller level in your societies. Like in Morocco, we discovered that we didn't have a national registrar of the population to channel them the money efficiently and in equitable manner. And it's a project that was in the pipeline for 25 years in Morocco. And for many reasons, too long to explain here, we never delivered on that. And so, in that sense, the crisis has accelerated this kind of reforms. We discovered also, Moroccans, just human beings, citizens, that a big chunk of our national counterparts didn't have any safety nets. Living on a day-to-day basis, you don't realize it until it hits people around you, etc. So I think there's a big policy reform and, thinking going on in Morocco. How do we provide social safety net? And it was launched by His Majesty a project to have a full coverage of Moroccans in terms of health insurance and social safety nets over the next 5 years. So I think the crisis is an opportunity to think of the social fabric beyond economic policies and macro policies. What is the social fabric? What is a country? What is a nation? Westphalian sense of a nation in the 21st century. What makes us together? What is the solidarity mechanism? How do we, redistribute wealth? How do we tax? Etc. So, and what is important in the end is to have a very strong capacity to produce and project public policies, in sort of real time. What is the fabric do you have? What kind of policy planning institutions you have in a country with effective tools to respond to crisis? I think in general, including Morocco, we have done well in terms of macroeconomic policies because there's a tradition. We've learned our lessons. It took us 30 years, but we've learned our lessons. Like Morocco, foreign exchange reserves, we got help from IMF. We know how to do that. We accelerated and ramped up, like Rania mentioned, external funding. It was done by Morocco, front-loading loans from the IMF, EBRD, World Bank, what you have. But in terms of also monetary policy, widening the band of the Moroccan dirham, the peg, sort of finding, adjusting our fiscal policy. I think the region in general, is quite okay in doing so. But I think the crisis has also revealed that we don't reform fast enough. Mm. We do reform. We're not reforming, but we do not reform fast enough. We don't have efficient fabrics of public policies, and the capacity to adapt those public policies in real time, many entrenched interests, lobbies, lacks of competition in all countries in the region, with no exception, I insist, with no exception. I think the SMEs particularly, we have concentrated banking sectors that do not deliver, that do not know, that are not at size to take care of very small companies and firms. They know how to do, big deals, complicated, large financing, etc. But funding very small companies, $50,000, $100,000 turnover per year, 60,000, very difficult to access working capital in Morocco, at least, where we have a sort of quite developed banking sector. So in a nutshell, we've been able to manage. There were instruments, experimentation. I mentioned the cash transfer for informal sector worker. There are mechanisms that have been put in place to guarantee, to bridge the funding, to delay the payment, etc. But still, it's very difficult, and it's still very difficult in some very specific sector, like, cinemas, like hotel, anything that has to do with food, restaurants, leisure activities, it's still very difficult.
Thank you very much for that, Karim. I mean, you raise several issues, including this idea of safety nets and also the awareness of how varied people's fortunes are within one community. So I want to follow up on this issue of the role of the state with you, Dr. Rania. This idea that providing social safety nets, but also, whether it's thinking about health insurance, that's universal health insurance. Some Arab countries have it, some don't. How does the state adjust for that? Especially, as Karim said, it usually takes us a long time to reform in most Arab countries and bureaucracies. It takes them a long time to make those changes, and we can't afford that.
Yeah, so health, the health is taken very seriously, and a few years ago there was the initiative of no hepatitis C in Egypt. This was a national program, and it's being replicated in other countries, including in the African continent. Universal health insurance, there was a pilot case in Port Said Governorate, and now with the World Bank we have a new program that is also being we just got the paperwork and the approvals done with the internally and in the boards, and it's basically to repeat that in different governorates within the country. So it's the role of the state, and here I mean, Jihad mentioned something very important at the outset, is stakeholders, right? And so when we are thinking about whether it's health, whether it's working with electricity and moving to green, etc. It's not just the state, it's the state that's putting out the vision, if you will, and then providing for other stakeholders to come in. So if we're taking the universal health insurance, it's not just going to be done by the government, but the private sector is a partner in that as well. And that also holds for other sectors. Something that Karim mentioned, the social safety nets and cash payments for the informal sector. That is something that we were also able to do during COVID because, as I mentioned earlier, the platform through programs such as the Kafala and Karama existed. There was a database being set up for informal workers, and we were able to reach around 2 million with cash transfers during the crisis, and this helped very much. Something else, Alan mentioned absorption, and Jihad mentioned job creation, and Karim mentioned SMEs. So if I put all of that together, one very important lesson that we've seen, and why have our growth rates been more or less okay despite the pandemic, is because there were very important infrastructure projects that were initiated several years ago to be able to push the potential of the economy. So if you're talking about, for instance, very extensive transportation lines, development of new cities, being able to provide solar panels and solar energy, and having a strategy that 45% of our energy needs to be renewable before 2035. All of these were very, very important, I would say, state commitments, if you will, that were rolled out to push the potential, and that is extremely important. And we know that is important for employment, to be able to mitigate the impact of overheating on inflation and so forth, and also to create the connectivity that is needed for private sector to also be able to do its business. So having that at the forefront of the state, trying to engage with the international community through different financing projects, and you know, I have a portfolio of $25 billion split across the different sectors, which are extremely fundamental for the country, whether it's transportation, environment, housing, social housing, for instance, many health, et cetera, and it is, these projects are not just done by the state, but it's also through different private partnerships. We're not saying that the agenda is finished, no. All we're saying is that it's a start that turned out to be extremely positive and provided us that cushion in 2020. And that's why we are moving further with that. And the SBA currently with the IMF includes focus on structural reforms related to private sector engagement, competition, more on SMEs and so forth. But if there's, but again, it's continuous work, and it is again no complacency, as Jihad mentioned earlier.
Since I have you, I want to actually, and we are getting lots of questions, so I'm going to introduce one of the questions by Hana Sabri, who says, what is it that we could have done differently in order to deal with the economic impact? And she said that she believes that tourism could have had better marketing in Egypt for our sunny and relatively safer places during the pandemic. And so I ask you that because, like you said, it's both small enterprises, and tourism has been mentioned a few times because it's one of those sectors that has ongoing costs, but little money and revenues coming in. And of course, as previous Minister of Tourism, who's very knowledgeable about the region, how would you respond to Hana's question?
So I would tell her that because we do believe in reforms, the 2 years that I was minister, we had a structural reform program for tourism. And that led us in 2019 to the highest revenues in Egypt's history. And then when COVID happened, we were still getting sizable revenues until March. Remember, we stopped flights in around March 17. And right after that, the government, through fiscal policies and through the central bank, there were many initiatives to the tourism sector. And what is happening now is the fiscal stimulus that was mentioned earlier on. Some of it goes also into the infrastructure of tourism. Something else that we did, and it's proving to be useful, is we try to diversify the offering. So it's not just there are many trendy things. The ecotourism, everybody now is very much into sustainability and so forth. So these are things that are happening, but nonetheless, it is one of the sectors we have to all admit that is most hard hit globally. And the loss, whether in terms of capital, particularly for the aviation sector, is something that we cannot take, But the IMF has something in the Rio where they say that certain sectors should not turn into zombie sectors. And that, in my view, means that the government has to be mindful on how to continue, doing structurally what is right. And again, the issue today is not a country-specific issue with travel. It's really until all of us are confident that we can travel again and not get sick.
Thank you for that. And your reference to zombie sectors, and undoubtedly there are certain sectors that are going to shrink and others are growing. So Alan, I want to come to you. How can policymakers help facilitate resource allocation, be it capital or labor, from some of these sectors that will shrink during this period, perhaps forever, while others are emerging?
Well, look, I think that during a crisis, when you want to charter your way out of a crisis, there is definitely, we always focus on the lowest hanging fruits that seem to us, which is basically how do we support financially, et cetera, which is very important. But I think equally important is the fact that reforming and allowing for flexibility and innovation is also a great enabler of actually a better rebound. So we all know that some of the sectors, I mean, aviation is one of them that is hard hit, will continue to be hard hit. Hotels is another sector that will be hard hit for quite some time. But this is more of an acceleration, a huge acceleration of a trend that was there. Business travel is not going to come back the way it is. So there are a few things that we already know are going to actually be there for a long time, and that will really represent a big shift in the fundamentals of certain industries. So there is no point in continue to beat the same drum on that. On the other side, we already know that actually people want to come back to the way it used to be on some other sectors. I mean, for example, F&B and so on, movie watching. Whenever we have movies, now we have a problem with the cinema industry in terms of new blockbuster releases that were delayed. So this is why you don't have people in the cinemas. But whenever we have a blockbuster out, people are coming to the movies. So we are not going to have this issue like we have it elsewhere. So I think the way to deal with that is by reforming and allowing more flexibility and less hurdles within the system for people to be able to recycle assets, to move away from certain sectors, and in time be able to make it less costly and actually almost seamless from a bureaucratic standpoint, especially in our part of the world where we are to a large extent over-regulated. So in my view, deregulation and putting in place what I call non-financial stimulus, but actually I would say red tape-free stimuluses to allow people to reinvent themselves, shift from one way to other, repurpose buildings, move from certain activities to other in a way. That will be a great incentive for entrepreneurs, especially SMEs and also large companies, to be able to do that fast and adapt and rebound.
Thank you for that. I'm going to turn to you, Karim, because there's several questions to you. One of them is from Arif Al-Farra, who says, when can we expect competition legislation in Arab countries that would apply to state-owned enterprises? To Alhan's point, there are certain stimuluses that you can do or measures you can do that.
I think they do.
Yes.
In Morocco, they do. I'm not aware in other countries, but I do. There shouldn't be no reasons why public enterprise, depending if there's a monopoly by nature, but in sectors that are competitive by nature, competition policies should apply to, of course, to the public, so state-owned enterprise. There's no reasons.
So in Morocco, it's that non-competitiveness, so to speak, is not really an issue. You don't see that as an issue that state-owned enterprises.
I think competition in general is an issue, level playing field, etc. They are concentrated sectors. It's an issue, but an issue with public enterprises. In particular, depending if you have electricity provision is by nature a sort of monopoly, you can introduce competition with regulation. So I would say the question is like, robust and solid and predictable and first-class regulatory framework in several sectors. It includes energy, it includes, transport, it can include, this natural monopolies, I would say. Like we did in the telecom, it was quite successful. I think there are many sectors that are eligible for this kind of reform, but it has to do with regulation, I would say, efficient and regulation. And regulatory frameworks that are fully autonomous, etc.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Jihad, I want to turn to you because one of the things, that we've seen during this period is digitization, the adoption of new technologies. Some of that was coming anyway, but as you said, there was an acceleration. But one of the concerns that people have is that there's going to be increased digital divides between the haves and the have-nots. So how can we avoid that?
Well, this is, of course, a risk. And I think this is a risk that can be mitigated. And this silver lining that we saw during the crisis can become one of the main drivers for growth. Digitization helped kids to remain in education while they were not able to go to school. help many activities to stay alive. And I would say this is not an issue that only exists in the region. It even exists currently in more advanced economies. What the region should do is keep investing in improving infrastructure. I'm happy to see that, for example, in the GCC, the investment in the 5G has advanced fast. I think it's very important to use technology as a way to reduce the gap that exists already. And here I see at least 3 or 4 important areas where we can invest to narrow the gap. One is education. Developing through technology access to those who, even before the crisis, did not receive enough good quality education at student level, but also for those who need to be trained and where skills need to be built. Access to talent is going to be a big advantage that countries will aspire to get. Second, where technology is going to be very important is to reduce the cost structure that exists in the region that prevents some of our economies and markets to be attractive. And I think this is a discussion that I had some time ago with Alain. We need to move from cooperation to partnership. Markets are fragmented in the region, and the traditional way of regional cooperation is not the most effective one anymore. I think we need through partnership to grow the size of the market, and technology cannot be confined geographically. And therefore, whatever we can do in terms of harmonizing legislations, practices, procedures is going to be very, very important. There is one dimension that is also very important with technology. Marrying technology to certain number of, I would say, traditional activities will give a boost. In the beginning of the session, Mina, you mentioned that the Arabic footprint in technology is still not to the level that the region should aspire to get. And this is a great potential where we can not only create content in Arabic, but also have Arabic become one of the comparative advantages to many of our startups. Therefore, what I would like to conclude with, this is not typical crisis, and therefore we should not use our typical approach. The typical approach we have in the region is each will work on its own. The state will do the programs without consulting the private sector and consider that it's done. The private sector will turn the back and say, the state has never been very efficient, and therefore let's do it ourselves. And we end up not having the value that can be created by working together. I think if we look back, the 2008 crisis showed us, for example, that not reacting fast or doing too little too late did not help the region to recover. I will give 2 numbers to illustrate that. FDIs. 10 years after the 2008 crisis, we did not recover the level of FDIs that we used to have before 2008. 2019, at least we had 12 countries in the region that did not reach the level of pre-2008 trends. Therefore, I think time is going to be of an essence. Knowing how to work together is going to be clear. Accepting not to do too little too late. And also, there are certain number of taboos that we need to open up. Only the private sector can create enough jobs to fulfill the aspirations of the population. When we have a potential of $1 trillion of output with increasing the participation of women in our economies, and we're preventing ourselves from that, it's not only a social priority, but it's also an economic priority. Social is not against economic growth. At the contrary, social and economic growth should go hand in hand. And this is something that also this crisis revealed, that having the right social policies is also increasing the level of productivity, investing well in education and health. And recently we issued a paper on that, that we're going to discuss in a few weeks. It's critical. And this crisis also revealed the weakest links are also affecting the whole value chain. And sometimes the weakest link is the regulation. Sometimes those are soft issues. last but not the least, we're not the only region that is affected by the crisis. Many other parts of the world are affected by the crisis, and they are asking themselves the same question. Learning from what others are doing, I think it's also a way for us to do it better and to do it cheaper. But I think what is definitely the mode that we should all have is policy matters. And policy requires to have the right analysis, take the decisions, and adjust whenever we feel that things are not going in the right direction, and be transparent. And this is what we are trying to do at the fund by reaching out not only to provide financial assistance, but also to provide policy assistance. And in certain cases, we don't have solutions ready, but we're ready to think together to find the solutions.
Speaking of solutions and also being ready to adapt, we have a question from Ali Mbeya, a friend, I think, to most of you on the call. She says, looking into the future, and as we prepare for a post-COVID macro landscape, the question facing policymakers, and the markets are watching this, is how to unwind existing stimulus and restore fiscal and external sustainability while addressing the growing vulnerabilities and maintaining social cohesion, which is the points you were making, Jihad, just now. So what would be your advice for policies in terms of priority, and how do you do the sequencing of that? So I'll start with you, Jihad, and then I'll turn to you, Karim, also, if you can address this question, please.
Well, Mina, this is one of the main issues that many countries in the world are facing, okay? Because of the crisis, many countries have introduced a certain number of fiscal and monetary packages to help address the impact of the crisis and to provide a floor to the economy. The question is how fast we should start to unwind some of those and which one we should keep. But this is also has to be put in the context of the uncertainties that we are still living under. Definitely, there are hopes with the vaccine, and we all know that this crisis will end, but we don't know when this crisis will end. And the risk is to unwind very quickly, and this is why we are telling countries, priority is to save lives, and therefore you should, even if you don't have space in your budget, you should reallocate your expenditures in order to protect the lives of your population and also provide them with this floor of social safety net. This is a priority, and any country should do it. The second priority is some measures were introduced. They need to be recalibrated. And in several discussions I had in the last few weeks during the annual meetings with decision makers, ministers, and governors, and they were telling us that we started wide, and then now we are recalibrating. We're focusing our assistance. I think it's good to do this exercise, to look at what has been put as measures and to try to fine tune in order to increase the impact. 3, I think we need to start from now preparing for the recovery. And this is also one of the lessons of the past. If we delay and we do it in a sequenced manner, we lose opportunities. We need to work on the 3 tracks at the same time. How to address the immediate issues. And one of the issues that will become an important question for the region is how we can get access to the vaccine and how we provide the vaccine to all, or to the majority of the population, in order also to avoid here a major decoupling. How to manage in a proactive way the package of support that has been provided, and not to consider that it's a blanket, because it's temporary and it should be targeted and remain targeted. And I think what is even more important today is where the future will bring us. And the future is not going to bring us. We're also going to charter the future. And this is where I think it's very important to have a dialogue internally in countries with the stakeholders, private sector, some of the expert groups, but also how to unlock with reforms that we knew from the past that needed to be done. Reforming SOEs is a priority for the region. Making sure that we have targeted social support and address the issue of the old formula of subsidy we have will give us additional gain. Build on the talent that we have is also something that will allow us to accelerate. Therefore, I think the solutions are there. They need to be put together, and they need discipline going forward.
Right. I think that final point of what you said, that the solutions are there, there's enough lessons learned. It's about having the political will and actually pushing it through. Karim, if I can ask you, please, to address Alia's question, but also we have from Isam Sarabi asking you that what, from a macro level side, what would have a more immediate impact on the economy, fiscal or monetary measures? And Islam asks, why do you think fiscal policies are getting less expenditure allocations in the region?
Of course, it's both, I would say. But monetary policy, if you take the example of Morocco, rates are at 2%, very low. And it's fundamentally demand. You need to support demand basically in this context. So fiscal policy has to play its role. There are ventures like monetization of public debt that could be of interest for many countries. I guess rates are so low for countries like us in the region. It's not so difficult to get a higher growth rate that is higher than the interest rate you pay on debt. So I will encourage government to venture in non-orthodox instruments, but they require a very close coordination between the central bank and the fiscal policy, like we've seen, in countries like the UK. You take the example. Basically, they are anyway, you understand their debt. They have credibility. You know what is interesting? I think this is a very complex situation, and we should be modest. Economics doesn't provide all the answers. You need to listen to sociologues, politicians, etc. Politics. You can have a nice macroeconomic framework where you extract the benefits of both worlds in terms of benefiting from very low rates, accumulated credibility in monetary policy, so you can spend some of this credibility now, without raising inflation expectations in the future, while at the same time supporting demand and helping the fiscal, by monetizing debt in a way that doesn't sort of goes, in a crazy sort of fiscal situation that we had in the 30 or 40 years ago. There's a very complex balancing act that is at the heart of the political fabrics of countries. So if you have a weak central bank, the fiscal will tend, to continue to try to live out this nice world. If you have a very strong central bank and a weak fiscal, he will not play this game. You need also to give how you're going to get out of this, as was mentioned by Jihad. You have to anchor expectation. People are starting to be worried about inflation around the world. I'm sure you've been reading what's, in advanced economies those days. So it's a very complex balancing act. And when things are complex, what you do, you listen to others, you seek for advice, you decide collectively. Yeah. You share experience. That's essential because there's not a silver bullet solution. It's very difficult. Look at what the European Union, they're experimenting, they're making progress, they're socializing debt, mutualizing debt, etc. So I think this is one of the lessons I draw from the crisis, is that we have to be modest. There are no sort of one-size-fits-all solutions, easy solutions. We need to listen to others, and we need to have the support of populations, because you can do miracles, but if you think you're only one thinking that you have a good idea, if you don't have the buy-in of the population, the support, the patience, for the cost of reforms in the short term and the gain in the long terms, it's very difficult. This is why I started early on about the internal front. You need to have a strong internal front. And my last point will be for our audiences is a very interesting question that I asked to them, to reflect on, and we've been thinking of, is that most countries have reacted in the way you would have expected them to react. I leave you with this reflection. Look at every single country and how they have managed the countries, the crisis. And you will see that it is what you would expect if you have a good knowledge of every single country, the way they have responded to the crisis. And I think it is a moment for us as individuals, to reflect on what we do, to be reflexive, to look at ourselves, are we doing the right thing, to listen to others? It's what is true for us as individuals is also true for our policies and public policies, our policy makers. And this is what we've been doing in Morocco. There are experimentation. There is a commission thinking of the, long growth. What is the growth model for Morocco in the long run, consulting and listening to everybody. And I think this has to be permanent always. It's an attitude, it's a posture. And this is what we're trying to teach to our students, basically, Forget about everything you learn. Just remember one thing, the good attitude. You always learn to learn. What's the right posture, the frameworks, the lenses through which you see things. Don't be prisoner of your science, of your discipline. So I think this crisis, that's what I recall, as someone working in academia and in a think tank. Modesty, reaching out to others, listening to others, going beyond, economics as an economist, and for others true also to come to us, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, and permanent discussion, the buy-in of population, democratic purposes, deliberative democracy, participatory democracy, constant process of discussion. I think we need to, these are things we had in the so-called Arab world, although I don't think Morocco is fully in the Arab world. It has also other dimensions, but anyway, it's also...
I'm going to cut you off there, because if we go into the geography of the region and full blown swear with identity, we'll never stop. Thank you very much. Really thoughtful, especially kind of the lessons learned, because this is going to be my closing question to the rest of the panel. I apologize to everybody who's sending questions, because we only have about 10 minutes to wrap up. So taking on from what Karim said, kind of what was learned and what you've learned from this crisis, clearly one of them is the ability to learn, to adapt, but also, it's difficult. How do you make strategic plans, in all of your institutions when actually things are changing quite rapidly? So, Dr. Rania, I want to turn to you. Kind of lessons you've learned in 2020 and that you will take forward with you. If there was one lesson you want to share with us.
Humility. I think all of us have to be very humble with the amount of things we know. And just following up on what Karim mentioned, when we're humble, we're able to listen to others, and then that fosters more collaboration. And I think what the world needs today is more collaboration. There was this debate a few months ago when COVID started. Are countries becoming more isolation driven? Is multilateralism dead? For us in Egypt, it comes from political leadership all the way down. We're a country that believes in multilateralism. We're a country that believes in all of us having a place on the table. It's not just a matter of financing, but today nobody has that silver bullet. There's a level of experience sharing. There's a level of lessons learned from others. And as Jihad was mentioning, social impact is important, and that's why there's this concept of equitable growth. So how can we arrive to equitable growth? And maybe in my scheme of doing things as Minister of International Cooperation, I put that under one title, which is economic diplomacy. And economic diplomacy for Egypt has three principles. First, multi-stakeholder platforms, and that's where we have government, private sector, civil society, and think tanks. So it's exactly that constellation on the screen that I see. As well as the communication and press, Mina. So that's very, very important, because I think part of this crisis would not have been possible without more transparency between governments and the public to create that credibility for all of us to move forward. Second principle has to do with something very specific to our kind of financing, which is the official development assistance, ODA financing. And what is very, very important is that we're mapping that with the SDGs. SDGs are extremely important today more than ever, because they affect each individual, whether it's clean water, biodiversity, innovation, gender equality. The 17 SDGs are key. And the only way to be able to even invite more capital from the private sector or from banks is to always have the ESG in mind. And those are SDG centric. So ODA SDG mapping is what we're doing in the ministry. And then third is creating a global partnership narrative. Jihad was talking about regional integration and partnerships with Alan, and that is exactly it. How do we together are able to put a narrative, our narrative that we are sharing with all our development partners, people at the core, projects in action, purpose as the driver. It's people and projects and purpose, P and P and P. And then finally, for any country, there are certain global principles that we have to today adhere to more than ever. And how we basically are going to be competitive in this very changing world is how fast we do in those principles. Inclusive societies and a new social contract, regional integration, if you will, environmental stewardship, fourth industrial revolution, health, governance, agility to move forward, and education, of course, through different skills. How fast we move on those principles is what is going to distinguish us. And these principles can be done only collectively through collaboration. So my takeaway from this crisis is humility. And through humility, we are able to be agile to actually create that resilience that also was mentioned by Alan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rania. So we heard from Karim, modesty. We heard from Dr. Rania, humility and collaboration. Alan, over to you. What has this crisis, what has 2020 taught you, and how will you take it forward?
I would say resilience. I think we've never been as much in need of resilience, and I think we all measured and saw the lack thereof whenever it existed and how important it is. What I also want to say, my other takeaway out of 2020 is that we continue to not be able or to be unable to work together. I think this has been a great crisis to turn it to a fantastic opportunity. And I'm just going to give 2 or 3 examples. Her Excellency spoke about tourism, and Jihad did as well. Why don't we have a biobubble in the region? Why don't we have one tracing technology that we use, and that people can travel within the GCC or within some other countries in the region? What stops us? Why can't we, work together on basically our supply chain much better? This region is so fragmented, and going back to basically our proposal for regional economic integration, this is a great opportunity to get that. But we still lack, I think, one thing that's very important, which is a Middle Eastern or an Arab initiative to really bring these things together, with the private sector coming together, the governments, policymakers, as well as global institutions. I continue to believe that this is at the core of the future of this region. If we're ever going to go beyond doing more of the same and expecting different results. There is a reason why 2008 continue to be there in terms of the reality of our economics, and we haven't been able to get back to even for example, on FDI on the levels pre-2008, simply because we don't have a market for people to invest in. So I don't want to make it about that, but I really believe one of the other lessons is we continue to be unable to work together. We need a mindset shift. We need to really put our minds and heart around this topic and really decide that actually we're better off together than everyone on their own in this part of the world.
Thank you so much, Alan. Yesterday we had a food tech challenge here in Abu Dhabi, and there was a lot of discussion about food security. And one of the issues is what's required is to ensure even shorter food supplies. And so really more regional integration when it comes to even our food supplies would be vital. And hopefully that's one of the lessons we take away from this crisis. So Jihad, I turn to you to tell us what lessons you've learned from 2020, one lesson that you really think we should keep in mind to take us forward. And after that, we'll be wrapping up. Jihad, over to you.
Mina, thank you very much. I think what we wanted to highlight in this crisis that is different from previous crises is the real sector is at the heart of the crisis this time. In 2008, it was a financial led crisis that trickled down into the real economy. 2014, it was an oil crisis with the drop in oil price. 2001, it was a tech bubble. In the 90s, it was an emerging market crisis. This one is a multi-pronged type of crisis, but the real economy at the heart of it and the livelihood of people are immediately affected. And this is an important issue to recognize. And therefore, I think it's very important this time not to miss the opportunity of addressing the challenges that existed before and those that emerged during the crisis, not to recognize certain basic principles that we keep repeating, but I think they need to translate into policy makings. Policies are not fragmented, they are integrated. The working together is not only about meeting, but it's also programming our actions in a way that produce a bigger impact. Recognizing the importance of issues is not enough. I think what is important is how to translate this into actions. Alain was highlighting the issue of creating through partnership a market that can attract investment, create opportunities. If we don't do it, it will remain only an idea. And therefore, I think we have enough to focus on. What this crisis also taught me is leadership. Is at the essence of any success, and the lack of leadership is a real issue. And I believe currently in collective leadership. I think Rania mentioned it in a different way. The collective leadership is multilateralism, is to consider that we can together be more effective than each on its own. And I think this is something that prevails. With leadership is trust. And this is also one of the important issues we saw. And I think Alain was mentioning it in his personal life in the beginning of the session. When you trust the authorities in charge, you tend to comply with the rules that they put in place. When you trust technology, you use it. And therefore, I think building trust requires also some attention from us. And therefore, working on strengthening governance, state institutions, going back to the basic principles in terms of sound economic management are going to be important. It's not a typical crisis in the fact that it is affecting all of us at the same time, but I would say we have the tools to address it. And this is what we at the fund we're trying to do. We're trying to combine financial assistance in the area where we provide assistance. We are an institution that supports macroeconomic stability, and therefore we have activated new instruments for that. We provided emergency facilities, but also we provided grants. We're working in the context of larger forums like the G20 to help countries who are facing debt issues not to face the reality of not being able to address social because of that. And therefore, we're working on the various solutions. We are also consider that solutions and policies matter, and we're trying to be as nimble, as open, as humble as possible, in a sense to accept that we don't have all the solutions and we need to exchange and dialogue. I think we need also to open up to ideas, and also open up to maybe exploring new ways of working. And the discussion that we are having today is grouping people from different backgrounds. I think this is where we can find the solution. But my last, I would say not to lose time, because if we lose time now, we will pay for it, and the future generation will pay for it. I think this is the key issue that should drive us in the future.
Thank you very much, Jihad. You know, it has to be said, Mother Nature humbled us all. And the fact that you all referenced humility and modesty, at the end of the day, there were forces greater than all of us. And it's Mother Nature's way perhaps to tell us it's time to reassess. I would say I never would have thought that commercial flights would be grounded in the way they were, cinemas closing, as Alain said, in a way that we didn't expect, hospitals being overwhelmed all over the world. And in certain parts of our Arab world, actually, the hospitals were able to cope, something that I think many people would have expected the reverse to happen. So a lot of unexpected things, but I would say, you know, your words and lessons to take away: modesty, humility, cooperation, resilience, leadership, trust, and governance will hopefully steer us forward. Just some things to take into account also from the discussion that came up is the ability to be agile, but also to scale up. That the lessons that we've learned in 2020, the small cases of success have to be scaled up. Importance about the issue of absorption rates when we hear about big stimulus packages, making sure they're actually trickling down to those people who need them most. In addition to the idea of safety nets, which we've discussed in the region one too many times, I believe at this point we really should have been able to put them in place 10 years ago as we saw different uprisings happen in the Arab world. A large part of it is people didn't feel that they had a safety net that would protect them. So something to think about in the region. And then it was interesting to see how many times the 2008 financial crisis was spoken about in our discussion, because it shows you some residual financial issues remain. And so hopefully we will be able to take this crisis as an opportunity to build up on what we needed to before. Some of the issues that were raised in the Q&A were cybersecurity, sustainability, environmental policies, which we didn't have a chance to address, but they were very important questions because they should be addressed. And of course, the need not to be a hostage to your discipline, as Karim told us, to be open-minded enough to change according to where we can find the best solutions. With that, I thank you all, first of all, to our audience and for those who sent the questions and engaged with us, but importantly to thank our panelists who have been so generous with their time. One of the things that always upsets me as a moderator is you want everybody to speak simultaneously, because I feel like we're missing out on the opportunity to engage with all of you, but I'm sure Jihad, you'll bring us together again. So thank you to the IMF, to the Policy Center of the New South, to, of course, Dr. Rania, Karim, Alan, and Jihad. Thanks for having us today.